They tell you that once a cruise ship hits international waters, the laws of the land still apply. They lie. The only law out here belongs to the company, and if you see something that threatens their bottom line, you quickly realize that the ocean isn't the only thing capable of swallowing a person whole. I told myself I'd never put these words into a digital format, but the persistent paranoia has finally worn me down. If something happens to me, at least the truth exists somewhere. It was late September when my cousin, Liam, and I boarded a luxury vessel out of Galveston for a 6-night Caribbean escape. We were both 23, working dead-end retail jobs, and had pooled our savings for a balcony suite on the 12th deck. We expected cheap drinks, late-night buffets, and a sunburn. We didn't expect to learn how cheap a human life is to a billion-dollar corporation. The ship was an absolute behemoth, a floating city carrying over 5,000 passengers, complete with a multi-story glass atrium, an indoor ice rink, and a massive promenade. On our third night, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive humidity kept me from sleeping, and Liam was still somewhere down on deck 4, lost in the strobe lights of the ship's nightclub. Around 2:15 a.m., I stepped out onto our private balcony to catch a breeze. The ocean at night is a terrifying kind of black. There are no lights, no horizons, just a roaring, endless void beneath the steady thrum of the ship's engines. Because the balconies were staggered along the hull, I could easily peer down and to the left, catching a clear view of the suite 2 decks below ours. 2 men were standing out there. At first, I thought they were just drunk, their voices muffled by the rushing wind. But then the posture changed. One man, dressed in an impeccably tailored linen suit, pinned a younger guy against the glass railing by his throat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to look away. To convince myself it was just a rowdy argument, but before my brain could process the danger, the older man hooked his leg behind the younger guy's knees and threw his entire weight forward. The boy went over. There was no cinematic scream. Just a sudden, sickening drop past the white steel of the lower decks, followed by a silent impact into the churning wake below. The ship didn't slow. The engines didn't stutter. The older man calmly straightened his cuffs, picked up a glass from the balcony table, and walked back inside his cabin, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind him. I sat on the floor of my balcony for a full hour, paralyzed. When Liam finally returned at 3:30 a.m., smelling of cheap gin, I dragged him inside and told him everything. The next morning, we went straight to the guest relations desk. The receptionist's cheerful smile vanished the moment I used the words, "man overboard." Within 3 minutes, 2 stone-faced men in crisp white security uniforms escorted us through a hidden crew door, down a labyrinth of metallic corridors, and into a windowless office near the bow. The head of security introduced himself as Marcus. He listened to my account with intense focus, writing everything down in a small leather notebook. But when I specified the cabin number I had looked down at, Marcus stopped writing. He looked at his partner, a brief, imperceptible glance that sent a spike of cold dread through my stomach. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a smooth, patronizing tone. "The guest in that suite is a major international investor and a personal guest of the cruise line's board. Are you entirely certain you didn't see 2 friends engaging in horseplay? Perhaps he simply stepped back inside very quickly. He went into the ocean." I shouted, slamming my hands on the desk. I watched him fall. Marcus smiled, a rigid, empty movement of his lips. "You've had a very traumatic hallucination, sir. The sea air and alcohol can do strange things. For your own safety and the peace of mind of our other passengers, we're going to relocate you and your cousin to a more comfortable, quiet space where you can rest." They didn't give us a choice. 2 more guards appeared to escort us to our new room. It was an interior cabin on deck 2, deep in the belly of the vessel, directly above the engine rooms. There were no windows, no balconies, just a suffocating silence broken only by the deep, industrial vibration of the ship. When the heavy door clicked shut, I tried the handle. It was locked from the outside. They took our phones, for data synchronization and security verification. Our Wi-Fi access on our laptops was entirely suspended. We were trapped in a steel box in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Every time I picked up the cabin phone to call the front desk, a calm voice would tell me to remain calm, that an official update would be provided shortly. The only person we saw for the next 48 hours was a quiet crew member named Tariq, a dining steward from Morocco who brought us trays of food. He wouldn't look at us during his first 2 visits, his hands trembling as he set the trays down. But on the 3rd night, as he placed a pitcher of water on the desk, he slid a folded piece of paper beneath the napkin. When he left, I opened it. Written in frantic, hurried ink were the words, "No police out here. Next port is Cozumel. Satellite signal strong near the crew deck stairs at midnight. I leave my personal phone in the laundry bin outside your door. Dial your family. Run when the gangway drops." Tariq risked everything for us. That night, exactly at midnight, the lock on our door clicked open for Tariq's scheduled linen collection. When he turned his back, I grabbed the cheap, cracked smartphone he had hidden in the dirty laundry bin. The signal was weak, fluctuating between 1 and 2 bars as the ship neared the Mexican coastline. With shaking thumbs, I typed out a massive text message to my mother, listing the cabin number of the man I saw, our current location in the hold, and a plea to contact the U.S. Coast Guard immediately. I pressed send just as the signal died. When the ship docked in Cozumel the following morning, the door to our cabin was opened not by ship security, but by federal authorities. The corporate wall had cracked the moment the external world became involved. But the true horror came during the aftermath. Because the incident occurred 50 miles out in international waters, the legal jurisdiction was a total nightmare. The cruise line's lawyers dragged the case through endless maritime loops. The man I saw was never arrested, his wealth bought him a phalanx of legal protection that the victim's family simply couldn't fight. I'm back home now, but I don't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I don't see the tropical beaches or the bright lights of the promenade. I see that endless stretch of black water, and I remember the terrifying realization that out on the open sea, the law belongs to whoever owns the boat. The cruise brochures love to talk about the romance of the open sea, the endless horizon, the gentle waves, the complete isolation. But they never tell you what happens when that isolation turns against you. They never mention that sometimes, out in the dead zones of the ocean, the fog rolls in, and you find things floating in the dark that were never meant to be found. We were 6 days into a transatlantic crossing from Southampton to New York when the world simply vanished. I'm a maritime photographer, hired by the cruise line to capture promotional footage of their newest luxury liner, the Oceanic Horizon. It was a massive, 14-deck Titan carrying over 4,000 passengers, but by 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, it felt like an empty tomb. A thick, unnatural sea fog had swallowed the ship, heavy and gray, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet. The massive automated foghorn blew every 2 minutes, a deep, low roar that rattled the glass shelves in my cabin and sent a shudder straight through my chest. Unable to sleep, I grabbed my high-end mirrorless camera and went up to the panoramic observation deck on deck 12. The pool area was completely deserted. The neon blue lights of the poolside bar bled into the swirling fog, creating a surreal, sickly glow. I leaned against the damp glass railing, trying to adjust my camera settings for a long-exposure shot of the mist. That was when the ship began to slow down. You don't just hear a cruise ship stop, you feel it in your bones. The constant, deep vibration of the engines beneath your feet suddenly drops in pitch, turning into a hollow, labored whine before dying out completely. The sudden silence was deafening. I looked out over the water, squinting through the shifting gray clouds, trying to see why the captain had cut the power in the middle of the shipping lane. Then, the fog parted just enough for me to see it. Floating less than 50 yards from our starboard bow was another ship. It wasn't a modern liner, but an older, rusted cruise vessel from the late 1980s. Its white paint was stained with long, dark streaks of orange rust that looked like dried blood in the dim light. There were no lights on board, no navigation beacons, no cabin windows glowing, nothing. It drifted aimlessly, tilting slightly to one side, its rusted hull scraping against the water with a low, metallic groan. I raised my camera, zooming in with my telephoto lens on the dark bridge of the drifting ship. The glass windows were smashed outward, jagged teeth of crystal catching the faint light from our deck. As I adjusted the focus, my heart violently struck against my ribs. Standing behind the shattered glass of the ghost ship's bridge was a person. Through the lens, I could see a man wearing a vintage officer's uniform, but his posture was completely wrong. His head was tilted back at an impossible, broken angle, resting against his spine, yet his torso remained facing forward. Even from that distance, I could see that his jaw was dropped wide open, frozen in a silent, eternal scream. Suddenly, my camera's autofocus began to hunt rapidly, the green square flashing erratically across the screen. I pulled my eyes away from the viewfinder, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the expensive gear. The silence of our stopped ship was broken by a sudden, sharp burst of static from the deck speakers above my head. It wasn't a standard announcement. It was a chaotic mix of high-pitched feedback and a distorted, garbled voice. Through the crackle of the speaker, I heard a child's voice, crying, repeating the same coordinates over and over again, followed by the sound of rushing water and a frantic, rhythmic banging on metal. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stacked lounge chair. As I scrambled to my feet, I looked back out over the water. The rusted ship was drifting closer, drawn in by our massive wake. I could see the name painted on its bow, partially obscured by barnacles and rust. The Star of Destiny. I didn't think. I sprinted toward the glass doors leading into the main elevator lobby, my boots slamming against the wet deck. I needed to find a crew member, an officer, anyone. But when I burst into the lobby, the interior of our luxury ship had changed. The bright, warm lights of the promenade had been replaced by a dim, flickering emergency red. The digital touchscreens that usually guided guests to the restaurants were dead, replaced by rolling static. The low, deep hum of our engines was gone, but in its place was a new sound, coming from the walls themselves. It was the sound of wet, heavy footsteps, dragging slowly through the metal crew corridors behind the drywall. I took the stairs down to deck 5, my chest heaving, my mind screaming that this wasn't real. When I reached the main customer service desk, it was completely abandoned. The phones were off their hooks, dangling by their cords, emitting a steady, monotone busy signal. "Is anyone here?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the empty atrium. The only response was a wet, heavy thud from the top of the glass atrium stairs. I looked up. Standing on the landing of deck 7, looking down at me through the red emergency light, was a figure. It was dressed in the crisp white uniform of our ship's security, but its head was tilted back, resting completely against its shoulder blades. Its jaw was unhinged, open wide, mirroring the officer I had seen through my camera lens just minutes before. It began to descend the stairs, not by walking, but by a jerky, erratic crawling motion, its limbs snapping out of joint with every step it took toward the lobby that I turned and fled, locking myself inside my small interior cabin. I jammed the heavy wooden desk chair beneath the door handle, sitting on the floor with my knees pressed against my chest. The ship remained dead in the water for 3 hours. During those hours, the static on my cabin TV turned on by itself, displaying a grainy, black and white feed of an empty, flooded engine room, while the sound of a child crying played through the small television speakers. At exactly 6 a.m., the engines roared back to life with a massive, violent shudder. The lights flickered and returned to their warm, bright gold. When I finally gathered the courage to remove the chair and open the door, the hallway was filled with early morning passengers walking toward the buffet, laughing and talking about the thick fog. I went to the bridge later that day, demanding answers from the first officer. He looked at me with a cold, professional detachment, claiming the ship had simply slowed down to navigate a dense fog patch safely. He denied seeing any other vessel. He told me my camera footage must have been corrupted by the mist. But when I checked my memory card later that afternoon, the files weren't corrupted. The photos of the rusted ship were gone, replaced by a single, blurry, 10-second video recorded at 3:14 a.m. It showed the interior of my own cabin, taken from the perspective of the ceiling vent, looking down at me while I slept, with a pale, gaunt hand gently adjusting the vent slats from the inside. When you buy a ticket for a cruise, they hand you a colorful little map. It shows you the pools, the theaters, and the bars. But those maps are designed for the paying guests. If you look closely at the blueprints of these massive ships, you'll realize there are vast, hollow spaces between the walls, entire decks that don't exist on the elevator buttons, where the sun never shines and the rules of the surface world are completely forgotten. My name is David, and I work as an industrial HVAC technician. Last year, I took a job with a prominent maritime engineering firm, which meant spending 3 months living aboard the Monarch of the Seas, a sprawling megaliner, to overhaul its central ventilation and cooling systems. Because I was contracted crew, I didn't get a cozy cabin with a view. My quarters were a tiny, metal-walled room on Deck 0, right next to the roaring water desalination plants. Working in the underbelly of a cruise ship is a claustrophobic experience. The public sees the marble tiles and the glass elevators, but behind those walls lies a terrifying network of low-ceilinged steel corridors, smelling of diesel, ozone, and old grease. On our 4th night at sea, heading toward the deep waters of the southern Atlantic, I was tasked with clearing a massive airflow blockage in the primary exhaust line for the lower passenger decks. According to my digital blueprint, the duct ran vertically between Deck 4, the luxury casino, and Deck 5, the main dining hall. I climbed up the maintenance ladder inside a service shaft, carrying my heavy tool belt and a powerful industrial flashlight. The shaft was tight, the steel walls vibrating heavily with the frantic energy of the ship's massive movement. When I reached the level where the casino duct met the main junction, I noticed something completely wrong with the structural architecture. According to my map, Deck 4 and Deck 5 were separated by 3 feet of structural steel and insulation. But as I shined my flashlight through a gap in the framing, the beam didn't hit a steel floor. It kept going, disappearing into a wide, open, unlit space that wasn't marked on any blueprint I had been given. Intrigued, and assuming it was just an unutilized void space left over from the ship's construction, I used my heavy wrench to unbolt a reinforced steel access panel. I slid through the narrow opening, dropping down 4 feet onto a cold, unpainted iron deck. The air in this hidden space was freezing, thick with a stale, chemical stench that smelled like formaldehyde and damp wool. I clicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkness. This wasn't an empty void. It was an entire hidden deck, stretching out into the dark horizon of the ship's hull. The ceiling was incredibly low, barely 6 feet high, lined with thick, black pipes that throbbed like veins. Arranged in long, military-style rows across the iron floor were hundreds of small, crude wooden crates, each one wrapped tightly in thick industrial plastic. I walked over to the nearest row, the metallic clinking of my tool belt echoing loudly in the oppressive quiet. I leaned down, using my utility knife to slice through the thick plastic layer of a crate. I pried open the wooden lid, expecting to find spare machine parts or extra linens. My flashlight beam illuminated the interior. It was filled to the brim with salt. Coarse, heavy gray sea salt. I dug my gloved hand into the crystal layer, my fingers hitting something hard and smooth beneath the surface. I brushed the salt away, revealing a dark, polished leather shoe. A human foot was attached to it. A sudden wave of nausea hit me as I scrambled backward, dropping my knife. I swept my flashlight wildly across the vast, silent room. Hundreds of crates. Rows upon rows of them, stretching deep into the darkness toward the stern of the vessel. This wasn't storage. It was a mass, hidden grave, floating right beneath the feet of thousands of wealthy tourists who were currently gambling and drinking cocktails just 3 feet above us. Before my brain could fully comprehend the scale of the horror, a sudden, loud click echoed from the far end of the hidden deck. The sound of a heavy door opening. I instantly killed my flashlight, dropping low against the cold iron floor, hiding behind the row of plastic-wrapped crates. Through the pitch-black space, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of rubber boots stepping onto the deck. 2 voices echoed through the low room, muffled and distorted by the thrum of the overhead pipes. "The temperature is dropping too fast in Sector 3, a deep voice muttered, its tone completely casual, as if discussing a broken refrigerator. "If the salt freezes completely, the extraction will be messy before we hit the next port. Just adjust the secondary valve," a second voice replied, shorter and sharper. "The company wants this batch cleared before the Maritime Inspectors Board in Miami. We have 12 more coming down from the medical ward tonight. I held my breath, my heart pounding so violently against the iron deck I was terrified they would hear it. Through the narrow gap between the crates, I saw the dim beams of their flashlights cutting through the dark. They were dressed in the blue jumpsuits of the ship's senior engineering team, but they wore heavy, industrial respirators over their faces. They walked slowly down the aisle, stopping just 3 rows away from where I lay paralyzed. One of them checked a digital clipboard, while the other adjusted a dial on a massive, throbbing valve attached to the ceiling pipe. "Did you find the leak in the ventilation shaft?" the shorter one asked. "Not yet. But someone left the access panel unbolted on deck 4. We need to weld it shut before some curious crew member sticks their nose in here." My blood turned to pure ice. They were going to weld the panel shut. If I didn't move right now, I would be sealed inside this freezing, hidden graveyard forever. The moment their flashlights drifted toward the far side of the room, I slid silently along the iron floor, abandoning my tool belt to eliminate the noise. I crawled frantically back toward the vertical shaft, my hands scraping against the rough metal. I grabbed the edge of the access panel, hauling my weight up into the narrow maintenance shaft just as a loud, metallic clang echoed below me. A flashlight beam struck the ceiling right where I had been. "Hey! Who's up there?" a voice shouted from the darkness. I didn't answer. I scrambled up the vertical ladder with frantic, desperate speed, sliding the heavy steel access panel shut behind me and screwing the top bolt in with my bare fingers until my knuckles bled. I ran down the service corridors, never looking back, until I burst into the bright, neon-lit hallway of the passenger casino. The sound of slot machines and laughter hit me like a physical blow. I packed my bags that night and resigned from the firm the moment the ship docked in port, citing a medical emergency. I never told the cruise line what I saw, because I knew the men down on that hidden deck weren't operating in secret, they were working for the company. Now, every time I see a commercial for a luxury cruise line, I don't see the pools or the pristine beaches. I see the vast, hidden space between the walls, and I wonder how many souls are floating out there, buried in salt beneath the dance floor.